Hi, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about some of our favorite mechanics. Say hi, everybody.
Hey, it's Jude, the usual co-host, but we also got a new person.
Say hi.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm the extra. I am here now. Welcome.
And so
Glad to have you.
today, today we're going to be talking about our favorite mechanics and how cool they are. And I'm going to roast y'all for picking bad mechanics.
I want
So,
to make it clear it was favorite mechanics up front, not best mechanics.
if it was best mechanics, I think I would have just put all kicker cards in here.
kicker two, kicker XYZ.
Kicker,
Flying.
multi-kicker, replicate.
Yeah.
Strive.
All right. So I will pick my favorite mechanic first. And it's found on cards like Taiga Master Opportunist. And the mechanic is Flurry. And it's whenever you cast your second spell each turn, do X. I love this mechanic because my favorite colors are Izzet, and I'm a little Izzet goblin.
We all have little electromancers inside of us, and so that's fair.
Yeah, the Izzet
Well,
goblins tell me to cast stuff at flash speed so I can get it every turn.
I think my inner Electromancer is more of like a gutter snipe, but I feel you. I'm surprised that you put I was thinking when we were building the PowerPoint for this that you were gonna talk about suspend here rather than flurry. I'm surprised it's worked its way up your rankings and technically very short existence.
I mean, it's had cards forever though. It just always hasn't been
Yeah,
called.
it's just finally keyworded.
Yeah, it's just finally keyworded.
Yeah, which they probably won't use that in future sets because there's not a lot of reason to outside of flavor. But they've been doing it at least since AFR because the monk class, like the card called monk class in that set, was a second spell matters class. So
Yeah, I'll say I actually really like this choice of mechanic. So like when you say roast you, I'm not going to roast you because it actually fits the same concept of the first one that I will talk about, where I really like this mechanic because it just rewards you for doing something you already want to be doing. You know, you're naturally encouraged to double spell in, every format, but even something as simple as limited, you're inherently going to get ahead the turns you're able to start double spelling, especially in these prowess centric spell matters colors. And so I really like the natural design of Flurry. And yes, while it's only recently been keyworded, I think this has been like kind of a solid design for a long time. So I'm not roasting you. I think this is just a great choice.
All right. I think that's all I have to say about this mechanic. So we're going to move on to the next mechanic.
See, I have already welcomed myself in by cheating. I'm representing two mechanics on this slide because they are very similar. I'll be talking about Threshold and Delirium. So for those who don't know, Threshold is a mechanic that says when you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, the card gets a bonus. So for example, we have this old classic Threshold card, Nimble Mongoose, former Legacy All-Star Nimble Mongoose. And then Delirium is based on the number of card types in your graveyard. So for Traverse the Ulvenwald, for example, it wants 4 different card types to be able to do something special. And I love these mechanics because they, like Flurry, naturally encourage you to do what you already want to be doing, which is to play the game. You get cards in your graveyard just from playing. Delirium encourages you to be a little more selective and make more creative choices about what you put in there and how it gets there. And Threshold originally had the issue of them kind of underestimating how quickly players could self-mill themselves into a 7-card situation. But we can already kind of see with how it came back in Bloomborough and Foundations, where they're altering this mindset of, well, how do we reward you for just playing the game and make the rewards fit that play style so you're less encouraged to just, mind sculpt yourself on turn 2 and then just have your threshold turned on.
I will say, I think I like Threshold just a little bit more. just because delirium, like you have to like build your deck a little bit more specifically, and you have to like
For sure.
think about it a little harder.
I'm in the exact opposite camp of you. I like Delirium better out of these two mechanics because it has more of a deck building cost associated with it. But
Yeah.
that's just me.
Yeah, I genuinely agree with the Delirium take. I always felt strongly that there was a big benefit to having stuff like, okay, so I've played a lot of Modern. So I grew up, counting Tarmogoyf sizes.
Yeah.
And Tarmogoyf practically has Delirium on it for its power and toughness. It just says, all right, count your card types. So I like when you're forced to say, all right, well, we have planeswalkers, we have enchantments, we have, kindred instance. You start figuring out how you're getting things in the graveyard, and it creates a little puzzle, and I always liked that.
Yeah, Delirium is a little harder than Tarmogoyf because it only counts your graveyard, but still, I do agree.
Very much so, yeah.
Aspect of it.
I think Delirium has confused me a few times though, because of like super types aren't types, and
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
does this legendary count? Oh no, why not? Because it's a super type. What's a super type? It's like a type, but it's not a type.
Well, it's where you get to learn that I have played a lot of competitive Magic, and so when it comes down to the confusion of like super type versus card type, I'm the kind of person who's keeping track of everything in pen and paper anyway, so I've probably already narrowed it down.
All right. I don't have anything more to say about this card. Do you guys have anything more to say about this mechanic?
Nope, these are cool.
I could talk about graveyards all day. I will later.
All right, so we're gonna move on to you, Jude.
Yeah, so I've selected Flashback as my mechanic, which I think is just an all-time great. There's a reason they keep returning to it. For those who don't already know, Flashback is just, you may cast this card from your graveyard for its flashback cost, then exile it. I believe it is exclusively on instants and sorceries. In fact, no, I am sure it is, because the ability does not work as written with a permanent. But yeah, I like graveyard stuff as well. I like, being able to mindfully discard something, knowing I can get value from it later. Same thing with self-milling. And something that Lingering Souls shows off that I also really enjoy as a bit of design space is that you can make alternate costs for any mechanic, not just flashback. But you can make them cheaper than the main mana cost, and you can also put them in other colors, which is restrictive for Commander, but otherwise, I think is just kind of all upside. Because if you're in a mono black deck and you find a way to mill this, you can still use it from the graveyard. Although I would not advise doing that.
I like flashback a lot, especially how it works with the graveyard and discard, and just even some of the flashback cards you want to cast them twice. I will say it's pretty strong, so sometimes it kind of limits what the designers are able to do with it.
I think on the bright side, we've seen a lot of variations out of flashback. So where you said like this doesn't work with permanence, well, they've kind of revisited that and made flashbacks for permanence in a lot of ways. You have the way they've made like reanimation effects with finality counters, the way they've tried to do stuff with. Unearth is its own weird kind of flashback for creatures, but nothing is just as simple. Yes, escape is kind of the end all be all of flashback for permanence in its own way because it kind of keeps working. But I completely agree with you. Flashback has been popular every time we've seen it for a lot of reasons. Players like getting to use their cards twice. I think everyone has their own stories about Snapcaster Mage over the years, and it giving flashback to instant sorceries and just kind of the crazy things you can do when you give cards that don't normally have flashback. Yeah, great mechanic.
I've never gotten to cast Snapcaster Mage because it's like $50 though.
It's gotten cheaper because power creep, and now in standard you can play the new Teamer version, which gives flashback and has harmonize for the card.
Yeah, No, they keep returning
I
that
don't-
mechanic. There's the Sphinx that does it, Torrential Gear Hulk, Arcane Proxy from the Brothers War. So, there's a reason they keep doing it over and over.
An infinite well of joy is what I would call flashback.
It's like Kicker from your graveyard.
All mechanics come back to Kicker.
Yeah.
All right. Next up is my mechanic. It's Heroic. Whenever you cast the spell that targets this, you do X thing. I think a lot of my mechanics are like just like spell slingery rewarding, because I think like blue and red are like some of my favorite mechanics, and just like being rewarded for like casting a lot of tiny instants and sorceries. But this also works with cards like auras as well, and maybe a few other cards. But I'm just like a really low to the ground, cast a lot of spells, and Heroic can like really benefit my type of playstyle.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it rewards auras, it rewards combat tricks. I believe that was something they specifically were looking into when they made Heroic, and it does what it's supposed to, and that's kind of perfect. Combat tricks and auras have always had this issue where why would you play them when you can get blown out? And Heroic helps balance out the pain of people doing that. So
Yeah, I will say I like the variant of this that showed up in Bloomborough, Valiant, a little bit more, because that also works with abilities, like Equip being the main one. And I will say, despite not having equipment written anywhere on any Valiant card, I'm pretty sure, it's the best feeling equipment matters, like limited archetype I've ever played with. But Heroic is cool too. I like the more narrow focus on combat tricks, and Heroic is also repeatable, whereas Valiant is only once per turn, and they're both good mechanics.
Yeah, I
it's
just wish.
also very flavorful.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just wish Valiant triggered more than once per turn on some of the cards, because some of the cards are just like really like. Some of them are like really good and really powerful. Like, oh, there's a mice deck in standard.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't think standard players agree that Valiant. Should
Yeah, I
be
think standard players are pretty pretty content with that once a turn limit, I think.
And then, but then there's other cards that like aren't the mice, that are just like feel a little bit weaker.
Poor lizards.
Poor lizards. All right.
All right, it's my turn to talk about one of the best mechanics ever, and I will die on this hill. Proliferate is a gold standard of mechanics. So it's actually a fun little anecdote. Mark Rosewater has discussed on a couple of different occasions how Proliferate came to be, and I will give this very brief interlude, which is he designed a common card that said when it came into play, you could double your -1, or you could add an extra -1/-1 counter or poison counter when it came into play. And he got the feedback of, well, why can't this just be all counters? And he changed it to be all counters, and everyone loved it. And so he made an uncommon version that did the same thing. And then he made a rare version that did the same thing. And lo and behold, Proliferate eventually became a mechanic because everyone thought it was cool. Because Proliferate is awesome. Everyone loves counters. Everyone loves some kind of counter. And turns out people like having more of things they like. I also think it thematically plays well with poison, because it's probably the nicest way of getting more poison counters compared to Infect having its kind of burst potential that sours a lot of players.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what Proliferate does?
Oh, my apologies. I didn't read the keyword. Yes, so Proliferate is you choose any number of kind they currently have. So if you have a player with a poison counter, a planeswalker with a loyalty counter, and a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, you can just toss on another one of those. And if they have multiple counters of different types, you can add an additional counter of each one. So that worked really well with oil counters, for example.
I do like this mechanic a lot, simply because it's like works with every single type of counter. And so like especially like oil counters, there may not be a lot of like support for oil counters, but because
Mhm.
proliferate is a mechanic, now oil counters have a lot more support. And it just like
Yeah.
works with so many things and like helps out so many strategies while also not feeling incredibly broken.
Proliferate is interesting because it's one of those mechanics that is both very backwards compatible and very like forwards compatible. You know, you can do it with
Mm-hmm.
energy, rad counters, experience counters, all things that have only really come into existence after the first printing of Proliferate. But it does also have like some implications on how a set is designed. You can't just really chuck Proliferate into a set that doesn't have a big +1/+1 counter theme or a big -1/-1 counter theme. You got to kind of already have that structural mesh in there for it to really work, mostly for limited purposes. Mark Rosewater has
Mm-hmm.
also talked about in some of his design articles, specifically for Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Legions. They tried giving Proliferate to the Simic as their faction mechanic for that set, but they didn't really have the like counter synergies baked enough into the other guilds for it to make sense
Yeah.
for them. And of course, they would do it one set later in War of the Spark, which would then, as we said earlier with the backwards compatibility thing, work very well with Adapt, which had just appeared in Ravnica Legions. But, you know.
Yeah, it just kind of became the perfect glue for War of the Spark, where it played nice with Planeswalkers. It played nice with the mechanic they landed on for armies, being +1/+1 counters based. It was backwards compatible for, Adapt, as well as a couple other things like Riot. It weirdly played well with Riot if you ended up with a little bit of it. But yeah, it's a glue mechanic. It does everything you want it to.
Yippee! All right, Jude, I think it's your turn.
Yes, the mechanic I have selected here is Evoke, which is another alternate cost for casting something. I believe it only appears on creatures, although it could hypothetically go on other types of permanents, I think. But we've only seen it on creatures. Evoke just says you may cast this spell for its evoke cost. If you do, it's sacrificed when it enters the battlefield. And I know that we have like a modern player in the call who may have some strong feelings on
Yes.
Evoke. But I'm
Love
ready
Evoke,
to
hate the
defend it.
elementals.
Yeah. I don't know. I really like Evoke. It's been one of my favorite mechanics for a long time. I like that it gives a little bit of modality to your creatures where they can either stick around as beaters or you can just use them for their effect real quick. I will say, I do think that the evoke creatures that have a dies trigger are a little bit better designed than the ones with an enters trigger because it makes it more of an immediate choice. And I think you can also like make those stats a little bit bigger on the creatures that have the dies trigger, which helps make it more of a choice between just casting it and just evoking it. But what do y'all think?
I like that Evoke plays with Blink and Reanimation.
Mhm.
And it's just like, because you can evoke it, it'll be sacrificed at the when it enters the battlefield. But then with that trigger on the stack, you can flicker it. It's a new game object, so it doesn't sacrifice itself.
Mm-hmm. It has big play potential. I hear reanimation for evoke creatures, and my heart goes out to many people like drawing cards. That's all well and good, but I have evoked many a Shriekmaw in my day, and I have also reanimated many a Shriekmaw in my day. And for those who don't know, Shriekmaw was I believe a 5 cost if you just cast it at full value for like a 3 power flyer that destroyed a non-black non-artifact creature, but it evoked for 1 in a black.
I believe it
which
has
was
fear.
good clean living. It does also have fear. Yes, I did not read it word for word.
Yeah, it has fear rather than
a mechanic that no one should worry about.
Yeah. Different evasive.
I do think the evoke elementals from Modern Horizons 2 were a cool idea. I just I do believe that the cost of a card for a lot of the abilities, like Fury and Grief, I think are some. They were in theory very cool designs. They have not turned out in a way that I think is ideal. I don't like Endurance, but that's for personal reasons. As you might imagine, I like my graveyard right where it is.
I will say I think Endurance is probably the best designed of those because
I genuinely agree, and I hate saying that.
I will say I think what makes the elementals problematic is their free spell nature and
Yeah.
not necessarily their evoke nature.
Yeah.
I mean, evoke is how they're becoming free. It's less of an issue with evoke the mechanic. You know, it's an issue with the death to every format has been, you know, some kind of insane free spell at some point. You know, that's always kind of been the trouble child.
Free spells are extremely good.
Yeah.
Free spells are
especially
good.
when
You heard it here first.
especially free spells when they have as much like trickery with flicker and blink. I just think twice that evoke has. But yeah, the evoke elementals are stupid. Mechanics cool.
I've seen.
Yeah. Do you want to ephemerate your grief?
Ew! I don't want that to happen ever to me. Please.
I've lived it. It sucks.
Who up ephemerating Day Fury? Is this anything?
It's a good.
I mean, if you blink a Fury, it just everything's already dead. It comes back in, and it's like, oh, well, what do I scorch earth now?
It's a double strike beater, though.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Fury is a mean card if it actually gets to stick around. But evoke, cool mechanic. Wizards, please stop printing free creatures.
Yeah.
All right. Now I get to talk about a mechanic of mine that I like, and it's mutate.
Yes.
So mutate is alternative cost. You can pay it on its front side for a vanilla creature, or you can mutate it onto another creature. And when it mutates, you get an effect. And if you mutate on top of that creature again, you get both mutate effects. And if you mutate onto that creature again, you get all three mutate effects. And it just gets crazy and wild and rules intense. And I like magic rules a little bit, and I like learning magic rules. So I'm a little bit crazy. But mutate plays a lot of like makes me memorize a lot of cool rules.
Mutate is the perfect example of a mechanic that works so much better in digital formats because there's so much less to keep track of. In paper, mutate is a nightmare. That being said, I also love it, so I can't fault you for it.
I'm a little down on mutate personally. I like Ikoria a lot as a set. I'm an Ikoria defender, despite its numerous and sundry crimes. Mutate is not my favorite part. I like it a lot from the conceptual level. Of like, you know, the tagline of Ikoria, or kind of like the, I don't know, call to action for it was build your own monsters. And mutate is cool in that respect. I do feel like it's a little bit parasitic though, in that it only really works with itself. So if you want to build a mutate deck, you have about one set of cards which you can build with. So it can be a little suspect at times.
I mean, you can throw some heroic creatures in there, though.
Yeah, you know,
you can throw whatever you want in there as long as it's not a human. That's quite literally the rules as written.
Aren't like pretty much all of the heroic creatures humans though? You got to use the Bloomburrow mice for Valiant.
You can use there's a couple of random heroics up from around different parts. I think
there's some.
I'm sure there's something.
There's a Drake that doesn't have heroic on it, but it basically has heroic on it. And then there's an enchantment that gives each of your creatures heroic, but it doesn't. It gives them each heroic draw a card, but it doesn't say the word heroic. And
Yeah,
then
I just I scryfalled it. There are 14 cards that have heroic written on them, but are not humans,
yeah,
which is
but
more than I thought.
There you go.
there's also times where like heroic isn't written on the card, but it is
Yeah.
basically heroic. And like
Hmm.
there's
Hmm.
like two enchantments that give your creatures heroic-ish, and then there's some non-humans with heroic. And when they get targeted by mutate, their heroic ability triggers, which I think is
Yeah. And that's all well and good, but most mutate cards say when this creature mutates. So you're encouraged to jam as many as you
Yeah.
can into a single deck to get like repeated and multiple mutate triggers off of multiple creatures. And that's like fine. That's cool if you can get it going. Very fragile game plan though.
I think
Yes, it does encourage a playstyle that's very disruptible, unfortunately. It encourages you to bring in a hexproof creature or something at some point in the stack, but it is kind of the aura problem tenfold, and it's not the benefit where you get with something like bestow, where the stack died and suddenly you have a board full of little creatures. If your mutated monster gets the axe, then it's just gone and you get to put your big fat stack of nonsense straight into the graveyard.
If they kill what you're mutating onto in response, you still do get the creature, which is nice.
Correct. Yes,
But
that still works.
if they just wait until afterwards, it's like, oh, okay.
I think it's also I think there's a few mutate cards that are like good enough to like see play outside of mutate decks. I
Yeah,
think
there's like a
There are.
Razor, which is a naturalized.
Yeah.
That's always good.
yeah, there's the
Gem Razor's solid.
uh,
Yeah, good.
the octopus that draws you a card on combat damage is pretty good.
Sea Dasher Octopus, I believe.
I think that one also has
Uh,
flash, so like you can do it in response to something
Yes.
not being blocked, which is cool.
Yeah, there are a couple of neat ones that crept their way in. I remember being a little surprised that I think it was called Dirgebat. I'm a really big Godzilla fan, so all the ones that had Godzilla variants, I remember their Godzilla variant more. So I'm just like, Batra with mutate.
Well, I
So-
hope when we return to Ikoria, we get like at least a few more, but we'll find out because not everybody loves mutate as much as
I think the design space is pretty small too. Probably in the commander decks for a return to Ikoria though.
Mm-hmm. I think that's most likely. Yeah. Yes. Here we go. Here is the mechanic that brings everyone together. Changeling. Changeling's pretty straightforward. Changeling is a mechanic keyword that says this creature is every creature type. It's just good, clean living. This is the thing that keeps. This is much like proliferate. This is a glue mechanic. This is the kind of thing that allows you to do a bunch of nonsense with creature types. And if you're just a couple short, especially in draft, especially in limited in general, you're trying to put together your specific deck. You've got your merfolk payoffs, for example, and you're like, well, I don't have a lot of merfolk. Well, what if I've got some blue and green changelings? Those count as merfolk. And maybe you start tossing in. If you got a lot of changelings, you can start doing crazy stuff like playing a bunch of different lords with your changelings. But really, this is here as a love letter to back when Wizards was maybe a little pickier about what creature types they supported. Not that I think that's inherently a good way to handle it, but I remember playing a lot of EDH back when people said, "I want to play the Reaper King. I want to play Scarecrow Tribal." Take a guess on how many Scarecrows were in Magic at that time.
Like 20
I
or
want to
something?
say it was less than. I don't even know if it was 10.
Ugh.
And so that deck was mostly Changelings with a Reaper King at the front. So, Changeling created a lot of scenarios that would have not otherwise been supported, and I'm sure we'll see them again when the return to Lorwyn comes around in the near future. But they're just kind of a glue, and they all look a little goopy and weird. They made them a little less goopy and weird when they came back in Call Time, but if you look at those classic Lorwyn changelings, Amoeboid changeling is kind of the exact realm of normal they are.
Yeah. I like the call time changelings a lot too. I appreciate that each like world has its own specific design for them.
Mm-hmm.
I would say changeling it helps glue a lot of tribes together, and I think that can be neat. I think some tribes, when I see a changeling in them, I'm like, why do you have a changeling in them? Your tribe already has like plenty of support. But for a lot of like lesser known tribes or like anthems that you want to throw in your deck that only benefit certain creatures, like dogs, uh, changelings can like help out those sorts of decks.
Yeah, I will
I
say
remember playing. Oh, go ahead.
I'll say from a design perspective, I think changeling mostly matters for like limited play because in constructed you can just
Yep.
pick the good creatures from your tribe and use all of those. But changeling helps in like situations where you were describing, like, oh, I need a higher density of merfolk for this deck, and that's why it comes back so often in tribal sets or typal, I suppose. And then
Yeah.
that's also why Ixalan had a lot of issues because they didn't use it. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. I actually have a note here to the side of my notes for Changeling, specifically calling out Original Ixalan for its atrocious draft format, which a large part of the reason it was so difficult was because you'd end up in that situation where, you know, if two people at that table of 8 were trying to draft the same creature type and there wasn't, you know, an insane density of it, then neither of them got a playable deck. And that's unfortunate and miserable.
Especially in a
yeah.
block who was mostly marketed around creature types.
Yeah, it was a rough time. So, and I think you've seen it balance out. Like they brought them back for Modern Horizons, and gave us a couple of new fun changelings there. You know, we had them in Call Time, but in Call Time they were kind of their own like typal strategy was changelings.
Yeah.
Like it had some benefit, but like it was mostly a flavorful thing for the shapeshifters. But some benefits. You know, you got to play some of your elf cards that overlapped in green. You got to play some of your spirit cards that overlapped in blue, for example, stuff like that.
Kaldheim also had a decent amount of like class type matters, like Berserker matters,
Yes. Yeah.
stuff like that, which changelings also help.
Yeah, because for some reason a teacher is a creature type and not a class.
Yeah,
I think you're running into a mechanical issue where it's like, remember, all changelings are clowns.
Yep, and germs and Phyrexian freighters and sand.
And balloons. And Time Lords now.
They're snow elementals and they're also lava elementals.
Well, they're not snow because snow is a super type.
Oh,
yeah,
Lord.
but what I'm saying is that they're the cards that kill them, and the cards that like they'll be like a creature type that loves snow, and then they're also dragons, so they love hot and cold at the same time.
Spoiler viewers, I don't believe snow is going to show up on any of these slides, and that's probably for the best.
Snow is kind of a little bit.
Snow way.
Snow way.
Okay, speaking of Kaldheim and Snow, though, the next mechanic I've selected is Boast, which is an activating ability that you can only activate once per turn, and only if a creature has attacked this turn. You can do it at instant speed though, so you can do it immediately after they attack if you want to. This is not a mechanic that has returned since it was first printed in like 2021, I want to say. It was only in Kaldheim. It was that set's combat-focused mechanic, which is something Wizards likes to do in most sets, mostly for limited purposes. But I really like Boast. I think it's really flavorful. I like that pretty much all of the Boast cards like have what their boast would be as their flavor text in dialogue. Like Varagoth here, I waded through a river of fire to bring death to Bredegard. Like, that just makes me happy. The flavor text, like, reflects the mechanics in a kind of unique way. As far as, like, how it actually plays, it's, like, just fine. But I like it.
I will say I love, like, combat-focused mechanics simply because, like, I like attacking and I like being rewarded for attacking. And in some formats, looking at you, Commander, people don't like attacking, and they should attack more often. And this sort of design can like help encourage people to like actually move the game along.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think encouraging players to attack is an important thing for Commander, but also for Limited. Like a Limited can get into a lot of board stall situations where you just kind of look at your opponent's board, you look at your board, and you go, well, stuff's going to die, and I don't really want to lose my stuff yet, so I guess I'll just pass the turn. Stuff like Boast encourages you to just find ways of going forward anyway, and I think that's really healthy. I will say I generally prefer Raid to this, but I think Flavorfully Boast probably plays out better.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think technically there has been one Boast card, if we're going to actually here. I believe there was a new form of Arnie printed in the Aftermath set that had Boast. And I think other than that, I think it's like Arnie Metal Brow or something. Like instead of having a broken brow now, he's got a piece of Phyrexian nonsense stuck in his forehead.
It doesn't look like the card literally has Boast, but it basically
just has the mechanic of it.
Yeah. It's whenever a creature you control attacks or enters the battlefield under your control attacking, you pay 1 in a red. It's kind of like gives everything Boast.
Well, I'm actually myself right back. I was wrong.
That's okay. I mean, it is kind of a limited design space. Like you said, it's very similar to Raid. But I still like it. I also think it plays nice with combat tricks because it's like, okay, they're attacking. Are they just attacking to get the Boast, or do they have a trick? Are they holding up mana because they have a trick, or do they just want to Boast? Stuff like that.
I do think it's really cool that you can wait to Boast. So like, it was a thing in Call Time Limited, but also like in Constructed play with these cards where you would attack, and it was clearly an attack to trigger a Boast potential. Like a big one was was it Clarion Spirit? There was a card that's a 1-mana creature with a 2-mana Boast to make a 1/1.
Yep.
Yeah, Clarion. And so you would attack with it, and your opponent would go, they're probably just making a 1/1. So I don't. But you don't have to commit to the 1/1. Well, you can wait and see what they do in combat, and then second main phase, you can say, okay, well, actually, I have this 2-drop. I've decided is better, or based on your response, I'm going to do this 2-drop. Or depending on what they do, you can say, all right, well, now I'll make a 1/1, I guess. Like you can wait. I think that's a really cool design space.
Yeah. It's a mechanic that asks you a lot of questions, which I always like.
Mm-hmm. Make players make choices.
Yes.
Now is my mechanic again. And I picked Transform. And it's a card on the front that once you meet a certain condition or pay a certain cost, it'll transform to something on the back. I like this just because it's really cool and funny, and people say cards have too much words. Well, guess what? I have too many words on the front and the back. And you gotta read them all.
I will say, I love your choice. I wasn't sure if you were talking... When I first saw this on the slides, I wasn't sure if you were talking about like Transform, or specifically like this cycle or type of card from Ixalan, that's stuff that transforms into lands. But I love Search to Azcanta. This card is such a banger all around.
I think I like the ones that transform into lands the most, simply because lands are a lot more resilient. In a lot of like limited and constructed formats, people don't really want to blow up lands. But I think some of the non-land ones are pretty cool too.
I think the cool thing with Transform is you can see how they've iterated on it. Like the way they did the cycle with Search for Azcanta, I think is a much healthier way of giving a reward that's actually going to stick around. We first saw this mechanic in Innistrad, original Innistrad, and in some ways in that set, there are Transform cards that are flavorfully cool and mechanically kind of weak. We don't need to get into the debacle that is the multiple different ways they've tried to make werewolves work. But at the same time, Transform's always been cool. Players have always thought it was cool. You had cards like Bloodline Keeper. You had All Stars like Huntmaster of the Fells that encouraged you to transform back and forth, which was a largely unique thing at the time for Huntmaster. A lot of cards didn't really want you to go back and forth. But then you have these lands where you meet your condition that is sometimes a little tricky. Like Search for Escanto was usually a card that you built up over the course of turns, and eventually you got your crazy, value engine of the Sunken Ruin. But then you also had stuff like a Danto, the fort. And that was, that was secretly white ramp is what it was. Yeah, it made tokens, but it was white ramp, and that was cool.
Yeah, I like using a lot of the land ones as secretly ramp, especially a lot of the ones that are like easier to like transform.
Yeah, in colors that aren't green, because they can just ramp normally.
Yeah, but green green has a busted one that turns into
a Gaia's Cradle. Yeah,
it's turned to Gaia's Cradle. Yeah.
Growing right to the lock of the card name, I believe.
Correct. Yes, and then I believe there's a blue-red that turns into a Tolarian Academy, but because it was blue-red, it cost 5 on the front. It kind of only saw a little bit of commander play, but I remember when it was printed, it was one of those things where people just went insane because they were like, "Oh my god, it flips into a Tolarian Academy, and Tolarian Academy is insane." And it turns out when you have to pay 5 up front for it and meet some kind of hoop jumping through, that maybe it's not quite constructed playable. But we figured out that problem while everyone else was busy resolving their journey to eternities.
Yeah. Modular.
Now we're getting into the good stuff. This is personally a favorite of mine. I acknowledge that modular, which for those who don't know, modular is it says modular N, so it's modular in a number. Modular is the creature with modular enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it equal to the number. So in this card's case, modular 1, it gets 1 counter. And when this creature dies, you can move all the +1/+1 counters on it to another artifact creature you control. So modular was kind of built as a way to say you can build up your mechanical monsters, you can build up your robots, but how do you reward them when they die? Well, you can kind of repurpose them. And so the way you repurpose them mechanically is you can move their counters onto another one of your robots. It was meant to be kind of a bigger thing. You had cards like Arcbound Overseer, and I'm trying to remember, there was an Arcbound Dog as well. There was a lot of little higher cost things. But the way Modular has played as it's kind of moved forward, is that it's ended up being more of a +1/+1 counter mechanic that happens to also have artifacts mixed in. And what I've always loved about Modular is that it creates a lot of player decision making. So as any visual podcast watchers are seeing, the Arcbound Ravager's on the screen, and Arcbound Ravager is the poster child for the modular mechanic. Because if Affinity has ever been doing broken things, Arcbound Ravager was probably involved, for better or worse. But it also is the reason decks like Hardened Scales worked. It's the reason that modern Affinity that wasn't playing the Affinity mechanic worked. Because it rewarded you for creative decision making, a creative movement of resources. And it made up for situations where you could have a board that was just 20 different pieces and your opponent needed to do a lot of math. And if they did the math wrong, sometimes that meant they were about to take 17 off an Ornithopter, and that's okay.
I like modular, and I like that when the creatures die, their counters are moved onto something else. Simply because a lot of the times people don't like being blown out, and this can help with like the feel bads of like being blown out where actually you don't get blown out.
Modular is alright. I don't think I have any strong feelings on it, but I haven't ever really played with it very extensively either. So
you did end up in a weird situation with modular in modern that I don't know if maybe some older modern players in the audience might remember, but modern used to be the home of a sideboard card that saw a lot more play called Spellskite. Spellskite, for those of you who don't know, has an activated ability. It's an 0/4 artifact creature for 2 mana. And it had an activated ability where for a blue Phyrexian, so either 1 blue mana or 2 life, you could redirect the target of a spell or ability to Spellskite. So modular targets. And Spellskite is an artifact creature. And so Spellskite was a meta sideboard piece against decks that ran Arcbound Ravager. And you would get into some really weird situations with Spellskites. And you would start sideboarding in your own Spellskites. And you get into Spellskite wars.
Oh my
It's just-
god. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, it's almost as fun as mind slavering your opponent and spellskiting them to death with their own spellskite. It's almost as fun.
Oh, that's such a strange and weird play pattern.
Modular's cool. Anyway.
Yeah, this card is mine. So specifically what I am calling out from this card is MDFCs, and in particular MDFCs that have a land on the back. I love these things. Whenever I build a commander deck these days, I'm always jamming as many of these as is like viable in the colors as I can, just because it solves a core issue that, you know, has been around for as long as Magic has of darn, I drew a land when I needed a spell, or darn, I drew a spell when I needed a land. These cards are both. You do have to pick, you know, kind of accepting bounce land shenanigans, but I don't know. I love these things. Everyone loves these things. I feel like they just printed more in Modern Horizons 3, and I hope to see even more in the future because they're great.
So the MDFC mechanic is there are a card on the front,
yeah,
and there are a card on the back, and you can like choose which card to play. Like you can play the card on the back, or you can play it on the front. So
yeah, as opposed to transform, where it will shift between each mode. This is like a one-time decision that you make. And it doesn't have to have a land on the back. It could be like a creature that has a spell on the back, like instant or sorcery. It could be an equipment that has a creature on the back. You can do it in pretty much any like permutation of card types.
I think technically even the set that did creatures and sorceries had some creature and creatures because they did it for the Deans.
Yeah.
Yes, but I agree with your sentiment that the modal double face with lands on one side are just a great mechanic. Like you said, it helps mitigate flood, which is always a mechanic that like the mana system to Magic is staying. You know, it is what it is. It's a core part of the game, and so it's cool to see solutions come up to that problem. I love the Modern Horizons 3 versions of these. They can come into play untapped at the cost of life. I'm glad we got more variants of this style of thing that are not just the mythics from Zendikar Rising. Yep. And in a little bit of a bias, I really like that these exist because they made a weird little thing called Charbelcher and Manaless Dredge more viable. Because those decks no longer had to run actual lands, or could run even fewer actual lands. And I love things that make Magic viable in a weird way. So I'm just glad that this is something that they've been playing around with, and I look forward to them trying to find balanced ways to do it in the future. I'm not sure we'll ever get an untapped way to do like a 2-color land, but I could see them doing like a multicolored land someday in like a forced to be tapped way. But we'll see.
I will say I am a little sad that a lot of these cards have a pretty demanding price tag. There are some cheap ones, of course, but I never get to play them simply because a lot of them are like a bit expensive and like,
despite mostly being uncommons.
Yeah, I imagine the blue one, Slip into Stupor, I think, is the biggest culprit in that regard. And
that card is
just kind of like a
last time I checked.
Yeah, like a 3-mana bounce is already totally fine at instant speed. You know, a 3-mana like, you know, very flexible bounce, I should say. You know, and then you tap a potential untapped land on the back of it instead. Combined with the fact that, you know, I'm sure the opening rates for Modern Horizons 3 were kind of all over the place considering the price tag. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I hope they get reprinted in the future in a more available product, but who knows? Maybe we'll get Avatar: The Last Airbender versions.
Maybe. I will say they kind of have the same struggle that all MDFCs have, or all double-faced cards generally have. Of it's hard to reprint these because the set needs to already be doing double-faced stuff. But hopefully.
All right. Next is my mechanic, and that's looting. And what looting is draw a card and then discard a card. I think, as we'll see in the future, and as we've seen in the past, a lot of people like graveyard shenanigans, and looting can
What? No.
help enable graveyard shenanigans, and it's in a way that's a little bit more consistent than like mill. Mill is really good though. I'm not like dissing on mill. It's just sometimes I like
You can diss on mill. It's okay.
sometimes I like looting a little bit more, especially like if like the card that wants to be in your graveyard gets stuck in your hand, then you can discard it from your hand instead of having to find a way to like get above 7 cards. And like graveyard strategies are really powerful, and I like playing with graveyard strategies.
Yeah. I will say, whereas self-mill usually gives you a higher volume of cards going into the graveyard at one time, looting lets you be more selective with what goes in there. Same thing with rummaging.
Yes.
Looting, but in the reverse order. And all of those are pretty valuable for graveyard decks. It just depends what colors you're in.
Yeah, I'll say this. I was told we were allotted one no word on this podcast, and I'm going to use it here. Looting kicks ass. Looting is so cool. Nothing is more satisfying than just card selection, just raw card selection, and looting gives you that significantly more than something like a rummaging where you discard and draw after. Because like you said, you can draw, you get to see the whole selection of what you're working with and then decide what goes in. Any modern players will either love or hate Faithless Looting. You know, Faithless Looting is kind of a pillar of the format and has been in a lot of different periods. And it just enables so many things. For those who aren't familiar, if you're not, Faithless Looting, single red, sorcery, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards, flashback for 2 and a red. And that is just, that's a common, that's good, clean living. Looting is fantastic. I'm right there with you, Jam.
And I think it scales well to the power of decks because low power decks like card selection so that they don't get stuck with their low power things if they draw into only that.
For sure.
High power decks can abuse the graveyard aspects of it more.
Consider the card on the screen, Merfolk Looter, and the last time you saw just a 2-mana looter printed in limited, and the answer is probably not in a long time that wasn't at least a rare, because this effect is just so strong. It's deceptively very, very strong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of like newer sets will print them at like legendary or like higher rarities to like because they're pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. And if they're at lower rarity, they have some kind of mana cost usually attached.
Yeah.
Yeah. So spoiler, here's why I love Faithless Looting so much. Because we're about to talk about the mechanic I expect to get the most blowback on. So again, not best mechanics, favorite mechanics. I am a Dredge apologist. I love Dredge. Dredge, for those who don't know, the most broken mechanic of all time. This is Dredge N, so Dredge and a number. And what it is that when the Dredge card is in your graveyard, when you would draw a card, you can instead select to mill that many cards from the top of your deck and then put the Dredge card from your graveyard into your hand. So, for example, Life from the Loam is on screen, a very famous Dredge card, has Dredge 3. So if Life from the Loam is in your graveyard and you go to draw your card for the turn, you can instead mill the top 3 cards of your library and take Life from the Loam from your graveyard, put it back in your hand. This was meant to be just a little value mechanic when it was designed. You know, when they were trying to think of a mechanic for what was the name of, it was the second Ravnica set of original Guilds of Ravnica.
Ascension?
Ascension, maybe.
Dissension.
I apologize for Dissension. Yes, it was Dissension. Yes. So they printed cards with dredge numbers all the way from like 2 to 6. They printed 1 6, 1 5, 1 4, a couple of 3s, and very quickly realized that dredge is the most efficient way to fill a graveyard you have ever seen.
Yep.
So let's go back to the example of looting. Let's say you cast Faithless Looting and you draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. If you have 2 cards already in your graveyard that say dredge 4, let's go with the higher end, but not the broken end. You can choose to just dredge twice instead of drawing those 2 cards. Therefore, you'll mill 8 cards into your graveyard, and then you can take 2 more cards from your hand and put them in the graveyard. There are a lot of cards that just want to be put in the graveyard this way. There's cards like Narcomoeba, a card that when it's put from the library into a graveyard, you may put it into play. There's cards like Creeping Chill that say if you mill it into a graveyard from the library, exile it and cast it, which is then a drain 3 effect on your opponent. There's creatures that there's so many things that you can do with dredge, and I'll say this just to wrap up on my general thoughts on it. Dredge is a mechanic. The reason I love it is dredge is the ultimate Johnny/Jenny mechanic. Dredge is the mechanic that tells you to think about Magic in a completely different way. Dredge does not care about mana. Dredge does not care about like card efficiency necessarily. Dredge cares about getting your library into your graveyard as fast and efficiently as possible and working out of your graveyard. Your hand is secondary. Your graveyard is your hand. And I like when Magic is presented in a way that allows you to look on it in a completely different perspective.
I will say about dredge, it's a little bit sad that a lot of the times the front side of the card like never ever matters. It is always the dredge.
Yes, it frequently never matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think like there's some cool designs on some of the dredge cards that if the dredge wasn't printed on there, but then the dredge mechanic is just like, ha, you thought I'm the most important part.
Yeah, I mean, I think dredge is cool. I like graveyard stuff a lot too. I'm a Golgari girly at heart.
Same girl. Let's go.
Whenever a mechanic gets to the point where like the mechanic is more important than the rest of the text on the card, like we have a problem here. That was the problem with Companion as well. Another infamously bad mechanic, to a certain extent, Storm. So I like dredge. I think objectively, I cannot, in good faith, call it a good mechanic. Maybe if it was like, if you could only do it as like a replacement for your first draw for turn, that way it couldn't get super crazy really quickly. But
especially with
looting, really replace your draw is like the appeal of it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, especially with like looting effects, like because you can replace your draw with the dredge and then discard the dredge card and then do it again with your next looting card, replace the draw with the dredge.
I'll say this.
And then discard the dredge card.
Dredge is the format boogeyman that everyone loves to hate, and then something comes around. And suddenly Dredge isn't the bad guy anymore. People start wondering how this deck handles Dredge. Dredge is the deck that'll never die. Even at its worst, even in those moments where Dredge is like tier 3 or worse in Modern, sickos like me are out there trying to make it work. Dredge is not the hero we need. Dredge is the hero we deserve.
There's always sideboard for Dredge in every format.
Great Ludo narrative.
And you get really good at playing around those sideboard, and it's always funny to see how people handle different ones.
Yep. So this is our last mechanic, I believe, on the PowerPoint. And I want to talk about keyword counters. So Ikoria was earlier.
That's what this is for?
Yeah, it's for keyword counters. What, you thought I was going to talk about cycling?
Yeah.
I'm so happy you're not. I'm so happy you're not talking about cycling. Actually,
I mean,
continue.
cycling is cool too, but let me say, okay, Ikoria came out in 2020. It also came out about a month before COVID happened, which I think is responsible for some of the negative press that Ikoria got. But that's neither here nor there. Ikoria introduced 3 mechanics. Mutate, which we talked about earlier, and is a cool mechanic. It's very complicated, and I can't really ever see them doing it again outside of maybe Commander products or something like Modern Horizons. Wait, did I say companion for that? I think I did.
You said mutate.
Okay, mutate. That's mutate. Companion is the second mechanic they introduced, which is an abysmal mechanic that they literally had to errata for power level reasons, and they will never revisit it because of the permanent damage it has done, not just to several formats, but to the collective psyche of the player base. And then keyword
multiple therapists.
And then keyword counters are the third mechanic Ikoria introduced, and this is a banger. This has had such dividends for future sets. Renew, the mechanic from the most recent set, just would not work at all if not for keyword mechanics. Or I guess it would work, but it would just be called scavenge. But yeah, I think
we know scavenge is bad.
Yeah.
Scavenge is bad because it doesn't give keyword counters.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, keyword counters are the star.
Yeah, keyword counters rule really hard. I like how they were used in Ikoria, and I like how they've been used in pretty much every appearance since then, even just the one-off things, I don't know, Judge of Souls from MH3 that puts flying counters on stuff. That specific card is a little messed up, but keyword counters as a mechanic have been a gigantic leap for Magic, and I just wanted to celebrate them, because they rock.
I'm so happy you aren't talking about cycling.
Me too. I think keyword counters rock, especially with renew in the most recent set, and just giving your creature some weird keyword that it wouldn't be able to have normally, that it would love to have.
You could give something double flying with proliferate, which doesn't do anything, but it is funny.
Yeah.
I think keyword counters, secretly the best thing out of keyword counters is that they made combat tricks have a purpose beyond their initial moment. So since the introduction of keyword counters, you've had a lot more cards that say, put a reach counter on a creature instead of give it reach till end of turn, or put a flying counter on a creature instead of giving it flying till end of turn. And I just think that that's such a healthy bump to a type of effect that has generally been seen as not worth it in a lot of regards. And I think that's just kind of a side benefit of, like you said, a mechanic that just, it makes sense. It's one of those ones where I think we'll ask ourselves, and many people already are, why didn't we do this sooner? And that kind of just happens when you find good mechanics. And I'm glad that after all these years, Magic can still find these things where it's this just feels really good. Can this just be part of Magic now?
Yeah. I think we all love keyword counters. All right.
I know I do.
All right. I think that's all of our thoughts for today. So everybody remember to leave a comment and roast us for our opinions.
Or agree with us. That's cool too.
Yeah. Or you can also remember to drive safe. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.